Right now, though, we're going to welcome in our next live guest. We've got Harris Ligon joining us from Telegraph to give that second perspective on what's going on in the rail space. Harris, thank you for being here.
Kaylee, thanks for having me. Before we kick it off, what is your go-to July 4th cookout choice?
Oh, you know what? I'm a big barbecue gal. I love a good pulled pork sandwich, and I know that that's not like your standard, cookout fare. Like, it takes some effort to go to, but I'm a big pulled pork sandwich gal.
Mad respect. All right, let's get into it.
Love it. Let's get into it. And so we heard from Joanna Marsh a little bit earlier. She brought us some updates on the revamped rail service bill coming through the Senate right now. I want to grab your perspective on that as well, because as we all know, common carrier obligation has been a very hot point of contention, with a lot of people saying, hey, you know what? We don't know whose problem it is to enforce the common carrier obligation. Can you talk to us about what this rail service bill kind of says about that?
Yeah, look, anytime you see a reintroduction of a bill, I think it's interesting to see why it may be coming back up. I think there are 3 points that probably stand out to me. Number one, I think it's bipartisan, so it's coming from the state of Wisconsin, the state of Kansas, both heavily rail-served states. So it's good that that elected officials are paying attention to their constituents' concerns. I think that's always a good thing in a democracy. The second piece that I really was kind of thoughtful about as I was reading through the bill, it encourages the Surface Transportation Board to do quite a few things, like measure whether crews are showing up or there's availability of equipment. It doesn't really encourage or outline a way to do that accurately, and so I think it attempts to compel the Surface Transportation Board to do quite a many things. But I think part of the challenge is there's no real structure for measurement, and I think the third piece that really comes out of that is that I think Joanna put out a fairly substantial article earlier this week that talking about how a lot of industries, railroads included, struggle with the term integration or the ability to share data. And so when I think through all of those items, I think there are a lot of politicians that are out there that are looking to do well by their constituents. I don't know that this bill changes the way that the Surface Transportation Board is going to enact any legislation or coordinate any reviews going forward.
So the fact that this bill is both bipartisan from legislators from Wisconsin and Kansas is very interesting when you take a look at the service map of the new CPKC combined railroad, right? Because, of course, it's a very heavy served rail line specifically from those two states. And we know that when the merger was going through and being hotly debated, that will it stand up to the common carrier obligation was a very, very contested point again. Can you talk a little bit about if that maybe has some doing to it, the fact that legislators from those two specific states are standing up when the CP rail line goes straight through Wisconsin and the KC merger, of course, or the KC line, of course, goes through Kansas City?
Yeah, Kayla, it brings up an interesting point. Look, we are particularly bullish about any time additional competition gets introduced within the rail system, no matter how that happens. And I think this is a really good example that CPKC as a joint entity has really invested quite a bit of time, effort, and opportunity into making sure that their franchise is going to be a leading prominent feature in the North American rail landscape. So when I think about Wisconsin and Kansas and where those relate to on a map, and I think about the new access that's been opened up both north of the border and south of the border, and I kind of think through some of the additional bumps in volume that we continue to see out of Mexico, nearshoring is it's a big thing right now, right? Mexico originated volumes up, I think, 4% year to date. I think they're up nearly 16% week over week prior to the holiday. So I see this as an opportunity to create additional access to new markets for both those states and others that are along the lines. I think one of the more interesting things is that you saw last week CSX and CPKC also announced an additional kind of trilateral partnership with Genesee and Wyoming. So it's interesting that they're continuing to play offense as it relates to investing in new facilities, investing in a container fleet, and now investing in new partnerships to create access to different dots on a map. So the way I look at it as the common carrier obligation at large, what I'm hopeful is that greater dots on a map, greater competition actually leads to better service.
I think that that's really important as well, because a lot of people were concerned that we would see kind of this monopoly develop right across the eastern half of the U.S. and through the central U.S., but it just shows that they're focused on building out partnership and expansion, which of course then encourages competition. So that's refreshing to see. Let's move on to another topic going on right now. We saw some fallout going on from a bridge failure from the Montana Rail Link and BNSF incident that went on a couple weeks ago. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, look, it's always unfortunate to see any sort of derailment happen anywhere in the North American rail system. I think this one was particularly interesting because it got labeled explicitly as a derailment, but was actually a bridge failure at the Twin Bridges Road in Montana. It's a little bit west of Laurel, and it's a beautiful part of the country overlapping against the Yellowstone River. What was interesting about that is that bridge had actually been inspected in May, and as somebody who's participated in quite a few railroad bridge inspections, they are not cursory glances. And so I think probably what was interesting in here, and we don't want to speculate too much, is that there was quite a bit of snowfall, quite a bit of rain, and you have to wonder, was there some sort of degradation under the bridge itself that actually led to that? I think one of the good things is that, for most of the state agencies that have been on site and reporting, have been minimal impacts to the local community from what we've been able to read, and hasn't been a significant impact to the water level. So what I'm hoping actually comes out of this is that there will be not necessarily a more of a legislated review, but probably a tighter understanding that there are some bridges in some prone areas that probably need an additional review. So I'm excited to see that going forward, and excited to see both Montana Rail Link and BNSF get back online.
Of course, one of those aspects is the very increased runoff. As you mentioned, there was some very, very intense weather that was there up across the winter, and now we're seeing some very hot temperatures, leads to an incredible amount of rain runoff, which can help degrade those bridges sooner than they would be expected, of course. So let's go ahead and finish off with our last topic of the day, volume, and if that's going to rebound at the end of the year or not. Everybody's kind of waiting with bated breath now that we've started the second half of the year officially, wondering, okay, will we see a volume rebound? Will we not? What are your thoughts?
Look, I think everybody in the earlier part of the year was hoping that they could speak a volume rebound into existence. So if you looked at every earnings call, everybody publicly saying they were expecting the second half to be showing some signs of life. So far, we haven't seen that actually come to bear in the market. And I think even when we look at it more broadly, right, when we think about what's kind of going on in the broader market, right, Greenbrier, as we were talking about earlier, is talking about record revenues, and they're rolling out this entire rebuild opportunity. Whenever we see periods of lull in demand, we see a higher replacement rate. And so when you've got Schneider showing that they've got 15% of their containers stacked in May, and you've got JB Hunt saying that they're not really seeing any significant signs of life, I think those are good indicators, as they tend to be closer to the consumers, that it's going to be an interesting next 6 months. Fuel prices have fallen, they've remained lower, and so I think when railroads have the opportunity to go out and win business, they're competing heavily with truck. Truck is widely available and very cheap. And so I think when we think about what's going on even in rail pricing, back in June, we finally saw the rates come down for the railroads. So that signals to me that over the long term, there isn't a ton of belief or a ton of hope that volume is actually going to come back in a very substantial way for the next 6 months. So we're hopeful, but when we think about what's kind of it looking like, automotive, finished vehicles, construction products have shown signs of strength, but that's about it as it relates to rail volume.
So that number one tip that you would give for rail shippers to maybe find some good prices right now, or if they're looking to continue to use that rail, what is your number one tip to make sure that their service standard is up if they're looking to compete with truckload?
Yeah, I think anytime I think about getting engaged with rail service, especially at this point of year, look, rail service is as good as it ever has been in the past couple of years. So I would say lean heavily where you can get density. I would say buy with density, and more often than not, I would encourage you to talk to your market managers at the rail lines and ensure that the rate that you had 6 months ago is the best rate you can get today.
All right, Harris, thank you for joining us with your perspective as always. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Kaylee.
All right now we're going to go ahead and take a quick break. We'll be back with our next carrier update in just a few minutes.